Well, it's time to begin, whether we're ready or not. Here I come. Okay, so Ray is not able to teach this morning. He emailed and said that he was not feeling well, but I think they made it back from Cleveland. And so we're going to have a sub this morning. Give me just a second here and I'll... Okay, so we're studying from Mark's Gospel, and last time we were looking at chapter 10. We didn't quite finish that chapter, and Ray had in his slides the section having to do with what was it? I want to say Mark, but it's not Mark. I think it's James and John speaking to Jesus on the way. So we're going to start there in chapter 10. We'll back up just a little bit. In fact, we're going to back up just a little bit more than that. And we'll look at the section just before that because I think it's an important section. Chapter 10, verse 30, is it? Let me find it here. Verse 32. Which interestingly fits with chapter 9, verse 31, I think it is, and chapter 8, verse 31, which are the times that Jesus foretells his coming death in Jerusalem. And so when you read here in verse 32 of Mark 10 about this warning that he gives to his disciples, this is actually the third time. In fact, my heading says, Jesus foretells his death a third time. All right, so we're going to be looking at that in just a moment. And before we do, we'll have a word of prayer. Mark, any update on Olivia? Olivia was able to come home yesterday, was it? So she's good. Okay, her blood count had improved, bounced back, so that's good. So we're thankful for that. All right, let's have a word of prayer, if we may, to begin. Our Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for the opportunity that we have to come together and to worship, to study from your word. We're thankful for these accounts that tell us about Jesus, about his life, his ministry, his concern for others, his teaching, his coming as that ransom so that we could have forgiveness from our sins. Please bless us in who are sick and get that back on, but that's okay because we're looking at this section in Mark chapter 10. So let's just notice what he says there, verse 32. They were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." So as I say, a third time that Jesus has said this to the disciples. The first time is after Peter had confessed Jesus to be the Christ. And you'll recall on that occasion, Jesus tells them what's going to happen to them. And Peter says, "Well, Lord, this is never going to happen to you." And Jesus rebukes him. So he's been reminding them and telling them. And so he does it again. They're going up to Jerusalem. And of course, we know, they did not know, that he's going there to die. He's going there to be crucified. But he's trying to prepare them for what's going to come to pass. And it seems as if he's giving more and more detail. It's getting more and more specific because here he says, It's the chief priests and scribes. They'll condemn him to death, give him to the Gentiles, mock him, spit on him, flog him, kill him. So that's the context, and we'll see if we get our slides up here that we've got a couple of pictures of this journey that they're making. They're not yet to Jericho. They'll get there in a moment, but Jericho up to Jerusalem is 3,500 feet going up, in addition to which it's about 16, 17, 18 miles. So it sounds like just kind of a passing comment. My guess is that, there was probably some discussion about this. But that's the setting that leads into verse 35. And we're all familiar with this. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." Sounds a little bit ambitious, doesn't it? Would you kind of blank check here, fill in the amount? And he says, "What do you want me to do for you?" Now, hang on to that. What do you want me to do for you? Okay? And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." What do you suppose they were thinking of when they made that request? Yeah, reigning as a king. They're headed toward Jerusalem. Jerusalem is where the kings reign, although they haven't been reigning for quite some time, have they? Over 500 years. But they're anticipating a kingdom over which a king is going to reign. And so, could we have one on the right hand, one on the left? A position of power, authority, it seems to be. And so Jesus responds and says, "You do not know what you are asking." Is that accurate? Yeah, they didn't know what they were asking. But he goes on to ask, "Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "We are able." All right, so what's Jesus talking about here? And again, we have the benefit of hindsight. When he says, "Are you able to drink the cup? Are you able to be baptized with my baptism?" Okay. Okay. Okay, so Rick says, are they willing to go through what he had described back there in verses 34 and 35, or 33 and 34? And I think that really makes the point that even though Jesus was talking about that and warning them about that, where are they in their thinking? As the British would say, they're miles away. They're thinking about other things. And they're thinking about the grandeur of this coming kingdom and Jesus having his authority and he's going to rule. And so he kind of gives them a dose of reality, even though I don't think they really grasp it. And he goes on to say, verse 39, "The cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized." So I think, as Rick says, he's relating it back to what he had told them. But then he says, "To sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." And then, not surprisingly, verse 41, "And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John." Why do you suppose they were upset? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Why? It's kind of like, you're racing to see who gets there first. Who's going to be the first to request it. And maybe the excitement is rising as they get closer to Jerusalem. And so, I'm going to get my request in early. But it seems like they're all thinking in those terms. And so Jesus uses this as an opportunity to teach one of the great lessons that he taught. So let's look at what he tells them, in addition to You're going to drink the cup. You're going to be baptized with my baptism. And there's no mistaking that after the fact, he's talking about the suffering through which he's going to go. And he's warned them about the suffering through which they will have to go. In fact, if you back up to Mark chapter 8, where Peter makes that confession, Jesus goes on to say, I don't know if it's in Mark's account, I know it's in Matthew's account, that's where he talks about the nature of discipleship and what's going to be required. And I think he's giving them a dose of reality. So, verse 42, here he says, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. So, what's Jesus talking about here? What's he telling them? Okay. Yeah, they're wanting rule, they're wanting some kind of power, some kind of right, and he's talking about humility. Really, service, he mentions here. Do you think that's right? Those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them? Their great ones exercise authority over them? Is that how it works with the Gentiles? Yeah, I think Michael's right. That's how it works with everyone. Is that still true today? Is that, to a large degree at least, how the business world works? Is that how the political world works? Is that how our culture sees things? Okay. We like a hierarchy, Rick says. Okay, so, there's got to be kind of a pecking order. That's how the military works. And, you need that authority in a lot of those instances. But because it's like that, where does the attention seem to be? It seems to be on, getting up higher and higher. And what Jesus says is, that's not what it's like in my kingdom. It shall not be so among you. And then notice what he says, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. Okay, what's the difference between a servant and a slave, or is there one? Yeah. Okay, so the servant is one who's voluntarily waiting. I mean, maybe he's doing it because he needs a position, and so he's willing to serve. The slave is someone who's owned by someone else, and he's lost all of his rights and all of his freedom. So Jesus almost takes this to another level by saying, not only a servant, but first you must be a slave. That might have been incomprehensible in their way of thinking, Michael. Okay. Okay. Yeah, maybe there's a difference in terms of the greatness versus being first. Of course, when he says first, his point is what? First in what? Yeah, service. Just the opposite of what they would think as first as. They would think as first as having all the power. He's really saying first, the nature of this kingdom first is this nature of the service, which is helping and serving others. Yeah, Rick? Okay. Okay. So their desire set aside, does that mean that Jesus is talking about you don't even have a will of your own? You're not even permitted to speak or to think? Is that kind of what he's driving at here? Okay, willfully go there? Yeah. Yeah, not in the sense of being devoid of any kind of personal choice, whatever, but the idea that I'm really going to make others the focus of what it is that I'm doing. So it's willingly, it's personally, individually taking that willingness to serve in that way upon oneself and to make others more important than self. Not because you're forced into that position and you don't have any other options, but because that's just the nature of what this is like. So Jesus is giving a dramatic contrast between how worldly kingdoms work and how his kingdom works. And what underlies all of that discussion that makes this powerful? Look at verse 45. Yeah, go ahead. Is Jesus living this? Is he doing it? Or is he just teaching others they need to do it? His whole life has reflected this, quote, philosophy, if we want to call it that, this way of thinking. And that's what he's saying in verse 45. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Okay, so Jesus came in order to issue a payment. You know, he doesn't go into detail here, but he's talking about a ransom for sin, the basis on which many can be saved from sin. How far-reaching is that many? Is all the good Jews that he's talking about here? Yeah. Eventually it exceeds to everybody. So he really does mean the many, not just the few, not just meaning the select. So he's teaching this lesson. Do you think they get it? No. Do you think we get it? Not all the time. Do you think we can learn from this lesson that he was teaching them? I think we can. You know, we all need this. So what does that mean? I mean, just let's translate that into everyday life. What does this way of thinking mean? Give me an example. Something you would do or something you would think. If we're operating based on doing what Jesus says here. Must be pretty tough, huh? Okay. All right, just the fact that we're thinking of doing for someone else. You know, when you walk in a restaurant and you're seated at the table, what's your expectation? Where's that waiter? Where's that waitress? You know, I need this, I need that. Okay, but this is different. This is me thinking of myself as serving others, looking for opportunities to serve. Does that ever happen in a family? Does it ever happen in a business? Do those opportunities arise where you could actually serve somebody else? Does it happen in a church? Yeah, so looking for opportunities to serve. And really, not just looking for opportunities to serve, but being a servant, you know, becoming a servant. That's not easily done. And as we said earlier, I don't think our culture even though I think there are some things about it that have been influenced by teaching like this, I don't think it's there yet. So a lot of times we're pushing against the grain when we think like this and when we make efforts like these. Mark? Okay. Great point. So showing up for worship, yeah, we benefit, but what about others? Sylvia? Yeah, yeah. Not lording it, yeah. That's kind of like step number one is to have this kind of attitude and operate in this way. I have a friend who taught a lesson from that passage, and the phrase he kept using throughout this sermon was, "See yourselves in a serving role." Parents, see yourselves in a serving role. Elders, see yourselves in a serving role. If you're an employee, see yourselves in a serving role. What does that mean? I'm looking for opportunities to serve. And do they crop up? They're everywhere. And we can do that and we can be that. And that's what his kingdom is all about. Yeah, Ian? Yeah, okay, good. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Good. Sorry. Yeah, so Ian mentions motivation, and that's so important. And really, what is the motivation? Are we serving the master? And if you look at a lot of those passages, what's echoed in passage, do this as unto the Lord. Yeah, I'm doing this, but I'm serving him. I'm doing that, but I'm serving him, right? Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Rick makes a great point. Even in other settings, we kind of try to subvert that. I was just thinking, you're waiting in a grocery store line. Who's most important in this? I am. I mean, I'm guilty of that. What about me? Get them through so I can get through. What if somebody else has a need at some point there? Somebody has problems at the cash register, and what are we thinking? Come on, get through there. What's the problem? Yeah. So there's just a lot of manifestations of this. And that's not to say, that there isn't something to be said for efficiency and all that kind of, but it's a mindset, isn't it? And it permeates a lot of different things. So, just great lessons that Jesus is teaching. And did the apostles have an opportunity to learn these lessons? They did. And it seems like they understood more and more as they went through their ministries. Okay, let's go on, and I want you to notice, it's not here on the slide. Okay, we'll get to that in a minute. Look at that next section. I want to just briefly notice. Jesus heals Bartimaeus. So they came to Jericho. In fact, I will go to that next slide. So Jericho's down there at the bottom, and Jerusalem's way up there at the top. So we said 3,500 feet, and here's kind of like, you're traveling down this road. So they're still at Jericho, and as they come along, they're leaving Jericho. Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, Bar meaning son, Bartimaeus, was sitting by the roadside, and when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." And how'd the people react? Many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. And he just cried louder, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." They called the blind man. So they got him up, and he came to Jesus. It says he sprang up and came to Jesus. Listen to what Jesus asked him. "What do you want me to do for you?" You remember a minute ago, James and John speak to Jesus, and Jesus asks, "What do you want me to do for you?" What's the difference between this man and those two disciples? What does he want Jesus to do for him? He wants his eyesight restored. "Let me recover my sight." To which Jesus says, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." So I had a couple of comments here. What Bartimaeus lacks in eyesight, he makes up for in insight. Great thought, isn't it? So here he is. He seems to understand a little bit better what the nature of this is. Of course, he's wanting his eyesight restored. But notice what he does. Immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. And where are they going? They're going to Jerusalem. And what's going to happen in Jerusalem? Jesus is going to be put to death. Now, not that Bartimaeus understands that, but it's interesting that he decides to follow Jesus. Okay, so a couple more slides, pictures, maps here. Here's that road as it continues toward Jerusalem. And this one, you can't see this real good. Yeah, Michael? Okay. Right? Right. Right. Okay. Okay. Right. And I also thought, along with that, not only do we get distracted, but one of the reasons we get distracted is because we do have eyesight and we can see everything. He had, quote, tunnel vision. I mean, he didn't have any vision, but he had tunnel vision because he knew what he needed. Right. Yeah. He knew what he needed, and he asked Jesus to do that, and he had faith. That's what Jesus says. Your faith has made you well. Okay, very good. So, I can't even pick out Bethany here. Okay. So over on the left is the Dome of Jerusalem. So this is just trying to give you a layout because verse 1 mentions Bethphage. If that's how that's said, that may be a mispronunciation. Bethany and then Jerusalem. But these are fairly close together. Jesus is going to go into Jerusalem, but he's going to go out at the evening to Bethany. And this isn't much better, so these don't show up all that well. But anyway, and I can't even make this out. Yeah, there's Bethphage on the right. This is the supposed route from those towns or villages up into Jerusalem. Here's a map showing on the right-hand side, you see there Bethphage by the Mount of Olives, which is a little bit higher than where the temple would have been situated over there to the left. And then Bethany a little further out toward the southeast. So just to give you some idea, here's what the city might have looked like at the time of Jesus. So this is looking from the south up toward the temple there on the right. You see the sort of the front of the south side of the temple. We'll notice another picture of that in a moment. The Kidron Valley is out here to the right, and the Mount of Olives would have been over on the right-hand side. Okay, and here's the temple itself. So you can see that facade there down on the bottom, the south end of that. And Herod was rebuilding the temple. He'd been doing this for a number of years, and this is kind of like the third time the temple's being built. Solomon built it, Zerubbabel came back and built it. Now Herod is trying to improve upon it. And the temple proper is that section right there in the middle. And that wall on the outside is to keep the Gentiles out of the inner section there. So that intersection would have been known, I think, as the court of Israel. And then the section on the right-hand side by the gate that you enter into there, that would have been the court of women. And then you make your way toward the Holy of Holies there. This is looking from the other direction, from the west, out toward the Mount of Olives. Would have been just beyond, if that was drawn in there, I think. So just some idea of what that would have looked like as they were coming upon it and looking at it. So they draw near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, and Jesus sends in 2 disciples. And we won't spend a lot of time on this other than to say he directs them to go and find a colt. And if somebody asks about it, why, you say, we'll bring it back immediately. So they find this colt. They throw their cloaks on it. Jesus gets on the colt and he begins to ride into Jerusalem to the shouts, verse 9, of Hosanna. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest. So verse 11, he enters Jerusalem and went into the temple. All right? Among other things, what is this pointing out to us about the events that are going to take place here? Jesus says, go in and you'll find an animal tied here and ask them for that, and then I'll ride that. There was a prophecy in Zechariah about one riding on the colt like this. Mark doesn't quote the prophecy. Indicate anything here? Okay, things are set in order. And who's aware of that? Jesus is most certainly aware of it. Again, the whole question of, his nature and all that enters into this, but it just seems like Jesus is aware of what's taking place. And he indicates that at every step of the way. And the people begin by praising him. Yeah, George? Okay. So the disciples are having a hard time absorbing this, and it was a lot to absorb, wasn't it? Just everything that's happening, they've got a certain idea of what should be happening and what's about to happen, and it's really almost the antithesis of that as far as what will happen. All right, so let's look at verses 12 down to about 25. And as he comes in, he sees a fig tree. Well, actually, in verse 11, he goes and he looks at the temple, and then he leaves, which is kind of interesting when you compare it with the other accounts, because he's going to cleanse the temple, and some would say, well, Jesus just kind of lost his temper and, just went rampaging through it. No, he actually left the town that evening and went out to Bethany and then comes back in, not before having seen this fig tree that doesn't have figs, and so he issues this curse, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. But he comes into Jerusalem, verse 15 of chapter 11, and proceeds to cleanse the temple. And he has done this before. He has been there before at the very beginning of his ministry. John chapter 2, he did a very similar thing. So on this occasion, what's Jesus upset about? What's at the heart of this thing here? I'm talking about his cleansing the temple, sorry. I wasn't very clear there. Okay. It seems like those who are the money changers, those who are providing animals, this was all done in order to allow people who were coming from other places, they wanted to use the right currency, Hebrew currency, so that would have been in the realm of understanding. They wanted to have animals to offer as sacrifices. That seems legitimate. But in the midst of this, it seems like what they're making this is something other than the worship. It's become something else entirely. It's become a matter of merchandise that they're worried about. And, he quotes from prophecy and saying, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer," notice, "for all the nations." Who did Isaiah have in mind when he said all the nations? It's kind of like the many back there in the previous chapter. Ultimately, is it just going to be Jews? No, it's going to be everybody. And it's kind of demarcated at this time, and rightfully so. I mean, those were the restrictions, where access was limited, but Jesus is saying, okay, you've made it a den of robbers. And verse 18 says, "The chief priests and scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching." Yeah, Michael, go ahead. Right? Okay. Yeah. Right. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So they've misused their authority. They've made it something other than it was intended to be. Yeah. Okay. Good. And it's interesting here at yeah. Go ahead, Ed. Yeah. Okay. All right, good. All good thoughts. And I was going to point out that it's interesting that statement about they were amazed and astonished, if you go back to the very first occasions in the Gospel of Mark chapter 1, where Jesus speaks in a synagogue and casts out an unclean spirit, what was the reaction? They were all amazed, verse 27 of chapter 1, so that they questioned among themselves, what is this? A new teaching with authority. So he's been doing the same thing all along. He's been acting in his ministry just as he always did. And it's getting the same reaction. And now it is the leaders who, it says, are fearful, but they're looking for ways in order to destroy him. All right, so let's look at this last instance. Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead. Okay. Right, right. Okay. So being a servant doesn't negate authority, and his exercise of authority, that's what he's doing here. Okay. All right. So good lessons to learn. Well, let's close with this one, verse 27. And I know we're all familiar with these verses in which Jesus is questioned, and I think this is the following day, because they come back into the city, verse 27. As he's walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes, the elders come to him. They said to him, "By what authority are you doing these things? Or who gave you this authority to do them?" Okay, a question of authority. Is this some kind of arbitrary question they're asking? Like, okay, let's pick at him about this. What would you say, George? Okay, it's a trap. And, is this just kind of like, okay, out of all these questions I could ask, I'm going to just, here's one on authority. But what does this really have to do with? I mean, I think it's bigger than that. I think it's just like, okay, well, we haven't asked him yet about authority. Let's ask him about authority. How does this all fit into this entire narrative? Authority. What's Jesus been doing ever since he set foot in his ministry in Galilee and all those areas? What's he been doing? He's been instructing them. And how has he instructed them? What were they amazed at? He instructed with, pardon me? Okay, miracles, yes. And that's another aspect. So the instruction, the miracles that he worked were done with authority. Whose authority? That's the question. And they're kind of saying, okay, are you operating on the basis of having the right to do any of this? And yes, it refers to what he had done the day before, but it really refers to his entire ministry. Who gave you a right to do this? Partly because, what does his right infringe upon? Whose right? The chief priests and the scribes and the Sanhedrin. They're the ones with the authority. It comes from the law, the Torah. And here comes Jesus, and he's subverting that whole thing. So, who gave you authority? Where did you get the authority? And of course, the answer is, he says, I'll ask you one question. I'll answer with a question. By what authority I do these things? Was the baptism of John from heaven or from men? Now again, you might just think, okay, the baptism of John. Did Jesus just think back, okay, I know one I can get him on. Baptism of John. Again, was he just arbitrarily choosing something that they wouldn't know the answer to or wouldn't be willing to answer? What does the baptism of John have to do with the ministry of Jesus, if anything? Here is John coming on the scene and announcing after hundreds of years, who's here? The Messiah's here. And so, you better be baptized because the kingdom has come. And then who himself was baptized by the baptism of John? Jesus was. And wasn't that kind of a momentous event when he was baptized? The dove descended, and there was the voice that said, my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. Are you going to just wipe all that out and say it didn't count? Jesus goes back to the very beginning of how it all started and said, what about the baptism of John? Whose authority was he operating under? And what was their answer? They wouldn't answer because they couldn't answer. Yeah, they knew it. If we say from heaven, why then did you not believe him? That is the foundation of everything he's done. If we say it's from heaven, then he's got the authority and the right to be doing everything he's done. If we say from man, they were afraid of the people, for they all held that John really was a prophet. The people got it, didn't they? Yeah. 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 You're taking away our authority, and who gave you the right? They wouldn't answer. Jesus then responds, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. Because he couldn't? No. Where was he kind of drawing the line? Okay. If you're not willing to answer, if you're not willing to be honest, and it's kind of staring you in the face, then I'm not going to answer. Not because he's unwilling to. The other thing about all of this, for him to claim his authority from God would be in their minds paramount to what? Blasphemy. Yeah. Oh, he's speaking like he's God's spokesman. Well, yes, that's exactly what he was doing. Okay. We'll stop there and take up next time chapter 12. All right. Thank you.